Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome our special guest. After beginning his career with early spells at the Boston Consulting Group and Salomon Brothers, he spotted the opportunities created by a wave of privatizations that swept former Soviet Russia and went into business with Edmund Safra creating Hermitage Capital. That business became the single largest foreign investor in Russia through a strategy of activist investing that brought to light the wholesale corruption and kleptocracy that was perpetrated by many Russian businesses, executives, and politicians. But when this strategy met with the disapproval of Vladimir Putin, he was ejected from the country, and his businesses and associates faced trumped-up charges. It was in fighting this corruption that Mr. Browder's tax lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested. He later died in 2009 before facing trial. Since then, Mr. Browder has campaigned in his name, successfully convincing several countries to introduce Magnitsky Acts, a cornerstone of the modern Western sanctions regime that is being used to combat Vladimir Putin and his war in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bill Browder. And I should say, before we get going properly, Bill's book, Freezing Order, will be available to purchase during the drinks reception. If you get in there quickly, he may even sign a copy or two. Now, first of all, Bill, given recent events, I just need to start by asking you for your impression of what's been happening in Russia in the last week or so.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about all these great concierge type things a couple of sessions ago. And I had a long plan to go to Queens to watch the semifinals on Saturday, and looking forward to it. I had a bunch of guests coming with me, and of course this coup broke out. And I thought, how absolutely inconvenient that they decided to do their coup on the day that I have Queens. The answer is that this is the single most damning thing that's ever happened to Vladimir Putin since he came to power. Vladimir Putin governs Russia through fear. He's a strong man, and everybody is terrified of this guy. And they're terrified because they think that if they do something bad, if they do something to challenge him, the best that happens is they lose their job, perhaps they go to jail, and maybe they die. And so for 23 years, Putin has sort of sat over everybody, breathing the fear of God into them. And then all of a sudden, in one afternoon, a mercenary with a bunch of ex-convicts or current convicts that work for him was able to take a group of them in a convoy and take over a large city in southern Russia, take over a military base without a single shot being fired, then move on to another city, take over that city, move within 2 hours of Moscow before the guy finally gave up. And what it suggests is that, and then Putin somehow, in his negotiation with this guy, allows him to safely leave the country instead of having his head chopped off on Red Square. I don't know how Putin recovers from this, because how do you continue to be a sort of ruthless strongman when that happened? And so I think that the next weeks and months will be very determinative of what happens next in Russia. On one hand, it could all continue to disintegrate for Putin, because once everybody sees that the strong man is no longer strong. And I should point out that in Russia, they absolutely despise weakness. They respect strength, despise weakness. So either he's not going to be able to reassert his strength, at which point being the president of Russia is one of the most profitable enterprises in the world. You'll end up being worth $200 billion personally if you're president of Russia. So there's a lot of people that would like that job and like that money. On the other hand, Putin may, and I'm sure he's going to embark on this exercise of a massive purge, going after everybody and anybody who he thinks has either been disloyal or not loyal enough. And you're going to see people in the military, people in the government, people in the oligarchy, all rounded up and either put in jail or killed. And And he may succeed in doing that to such an extent that people do start to be afraid of him. But what I can say is that in all the time that I've been involved in Russia, for Putin, this is the most terrible thing, and potentially the most optimistic thing for anybody who's hoping for an end of this terrible, murderous regime.
Okay, well, we may come back to some of that later, but I also need to ask you about what you're doing at the moment. I think I'm right in saying you no longer manage other people's money.
No.
And so you're spending your time doing other things, writing, campaigning. Can you tell us what you're up to?
Well, as you mentioned, there's a book. I wrote my second book, which is called Freezing Order, which documents our mission to find out who got the $230 million that my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed and was killed over. So that came out last year. But most importantly, what I'm doing right now is two things. One, very personal. In getting the Magnitsky Act passed, which was named after my murdered lawyer, a Russian opposition activist named Vladimir Kara-Murza came and tried to help me do that. He showed up at different parliaments around the world with me and testified how the Russian people would support the Magnitsky Act because they don't like their leaders stealing, killing, and doing all that type of stuff. And the Magnitsky Act freezes their assets and bans their visas. And he was such a persuasive advocate that I think we've now passed this law in 35 countries, and Putin hates it more than anything. And Putin tried to kill him. He tried to kill him in 2015 with a chemical nerve agent. He nearly died. He was in coma, multiple organ failure. They tried to kill him again in 2017, and thankfully the same doctors that treated him in 2015 were able to get to him. And then recently he went back to Russia and to protest the war. And he went on to CNN and called Putin a murderer and a war criminal, and he was arrested shortly thereafter, and he was now convicted and sentenced to 25 years in jail. And so I now have another hostage that I'm trying to free, and I'm traveling around the world trying to get governments to put pressure on the Russians to free him, perhaps in some type of hostage exchange. And then the more broad thing that I'm working on is, since I've spent the last 13 years working on freezing Russian assets, there's now a lot of Russian assets frozen. In particular, there's $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves frozen. And Russia has created at least $1 trillion of damage to Ukraine. And so I'm campaigning to change the law so that those frozen assets can be used to rebuild Ukraine, that can be confiscated to rebuild Ukraine. And both of these projects take up almost all of my time, so that's my main activity.
Sure. And the Magnitsky Acts, the various laws that exist around the globe now, thanks in a large part to your work, they're really a foundation, a precursor to the whole sanctions regime that exists now. Earlier today, we opened the conference with a speech from Robert Amsterdam, the lawyer and geopolitics commentator. And his view of sanctions, the current sanctions regime, is not a positive one, let's put it that way. And he feels it's an authoritarian answer to an authoritarian problem. He asks, is the situation we have now with regard to Russia better or worse than previously, before the sanctions regime really started to bite? What's your response to that question?
I'm friends with Bob Amsterdam, and we worked together on. He was the lawyer for Mikhail Khodorkovsky when he was in jail for some period of time. So we've worked on common interests. But he's absolutely, completely, and utterly dead wrong on this particular. And let me just start out with the most simple analysis. So Russia invades a foreign country. What do? Not sanction them? Just let them carry on invading without any consequence? Of course you sanction them. And moreover, so the person that wants to convince us that sanctions aren't working more than anybody is Vladimir Putin. And he says, look, we're so tough, sanctions we don't care, etc. But I can tell you they're absolutely apoplectic about these sanctions. And I can tell you they're apoplectic because after the Magnitsky Act was passed, Putin made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He sent his own emissary, a lawyer, to Trump Tower after Trump was elected, after Trump was nominated, before he was elected, to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, Trump's son-in-law, and campaign manager, specifically to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He chased me around the world with death threats, kidnapping threats, 8 Interpol arrest warrants, because he's so mad about the Magnitsky Act. As I mentioned, he tried to kill Vladimir Karamurza. He killed Boris Nemtsov, who was also Boris Nemtsov, the former first deputy prime minister. He hates this thing because Vladimir Putin values money more than human life. He's ready to kill for money. And so there's nothing more powerful than to take his money away from him. And looking at it very objectively, there's 2 ways to fight this war in Ukraine. One is militarily, and we're supporting the Ukrainians probably not as well as we should be, but pretty well. And the second is to starve Putin of his financial resources to fight the war. And we've done this in a number of ways. Putin, before the war, he was very self-confident because he had a huge war chest. He had accumulated $650 billion of Russian central bank reserves in foreign banks. And in one fell swoop, we froze $350 billion. So he doesn't have access to that. We also cut off Russia from access to the international capital markets, so they can't issue bonds or borrow money that way. We have frozen the assets of about 45 of the top oligarchs. And I should point out that it's not just, if you want to go after Putin's money, you go after the oligarchs' money because the oligarchs hold the money for Putin. And these oligarchs, sure, they find ways around it. There's all sorts of sanctions evasion going on right now. But they're also sitting lonely in their villas, staring at the walls, talking to their lawyers, and no longer conducting business, and no longer able to get access to their money to send over to Vladimir to fight this war. There's one huge gaping hole, which is that we, the West, or even the East, buys oil from Russia. There's a lot of money, like $500 million to $1 billion a day of oil that's sold, and that money is used to finance this war in Ukraine. And so if we really are serious about stopping the war, we need to suck up our guts, embargo the oil, stomach a higher oil price for some period of time, because that will truly bankrupt Putin.
Sure. Some people might say it's not enough that it hurts Putin and that he doesn't like it. It may have unintended, further-reaching consequences that, in the long term, are deleterious to our own utility as the West. Do you think about those unintended consequences, the lack of cooperation between nations in the world, the greater geopolitical ripples that may come because of this?
So there's two big, I wouldn't even call them unintended consequences, possible consequences to all these sanctions. The first one that everybody talks about is, well, if you're going to mess around with these guys and their dollars, then they're going to, or the euros, they're going to go look to China for their. Well, we have a room full of financial advisors and financial professionals. How many of you would advise your clients to put their money in China? Can I see a show of hands? How many people would advise their clients to put their money in China? Maybe you're just shy, but there's always one. Nobody would. And you're not going to put your money in Iran, and you're not going to put your money in in North Korea. You're not going to put your money in any of these places, because whatever we're doing, which might appear arbitrary to a dictator, is a hell of a lot more arbitrary what Saudi Arabia is going to do if you put your money in Saudi Arabia or China or whatever. And so, of course, nobody's going to put their money in those places. So I completely reject the argument that we're going to, by doing this with the euro and the dollar and the sterling, there's going to be some new currency that emerges between the South Africans, the Argentinians, and the Chinese that everyone's going to use. They're not going to. It's just not going to happen. And I can say that with 100% certainty. And then the other argument is, okay, but now we have this thing where we have the global South that's not cooperating. We have well, actually, before I get to that, the one thing we do have, which nobody expected, is the developed economies of the world hugely cooperating, which never happened before. We were also narrowly focused on our economic interests, that nobody, we were not cooperating on sanctions. Everybody was just trying to play their own game. And all of a sudden, we found when there's a major military invasion, redrawing the maps of Europe, we have to cooperate. And so all of a sudden the G7, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, everybody is now cooperating really strongly. Then of course, the other sort of counter-argument is, well, what about Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa, et cetera? And the answer is they're all playing a short-term game right now that is going to get ironed out very quickly, because South Africa does less than 1% of their trade with Russia. They do 40% of their trade with the allied countries that are imposing sanctions. It would be very easy for us to have a conversation with the South African government and say, if you value your economy and your trade, don't mess around, because we can mess around very badly with you. And it's very interesting because we started to see this happen now. So India was buying a lot of military equipment from Russia and buying a lot of oil from Russia, but they refused to pay the Russians in any other currency than the Indian rupee because they didn't want to be in violation of US Treasury sanctions. And the Russians have stopped supplying military equipment to them because they don't know what to do with these rupees. They're stuck with their rupees in Indian banks. The Chinese just last weekend stopped clearing Russian wire transfers through the Bank of China. It's all going to get ironed out. And so, this is the time when we have to have a muscular foreign policy when a country is doing such a terrible thing as invading another country in Europe. And it's just starting to happen, and it will continue to happen. So I don't, yes, there are all sorts of consequences. The main consequence is that all countries that have any thought in their mind about invading their neighbor should look at the pain that Russia is suffering from and come to the conclusion it's probably not worth it.
Sure. One more objection, if you don't mind, to
sure.
clear.
I'm happy. Throw them at me.
What about this idea that it's an authoritarian solution? It's sort of asset seizure, it's state overreach, exactly the kind of behavior that authoritarian states carry out. The West, democratic governments in the West are now engaging in that same behavior with the rationale that the ends justifies the means. But is that a reasonable position?
Well, first of all, it's not arbitrary, and second, if it is arbitrary, it's judicially reviewable. And so, Prigozhin's mother felt like she was unfairly sanctioned by the European Union. She applied to the European Court of Justice. They found in her favor, which I disagree with, and they released her from sanctions. If you feel like you're being mistreated, you can go to court. We have a rule of law in the West, which they don't have in these authoritarian regimes, and you can go to court. And I'm dealing with the British government on a daily basis on sanctions, and they're so timid about the whole thing and wanting to get it so right and being so careful because they don't want to get it wrong in court. And so this is not arbitrary stuff where someone is like creating a list of enemies and then just taking all their money away. And there's very clear criteria. And these people who are subject to sanctions are in violation of that criteria. If they believe that they're not, they can go to court. The courts here are very independent, and it's not at all authoritarian.
And what about this idea that enacting sanctions, bringing them to bear, it's difficult to choose when to do this? I mean, you might say there's a clear case to do this against Russia and Russian individuals connected to Vladimir Putin because of the war. But what about when authoritarian states do something short of invading another country? Would the sanctions regime, such as it exists and is available to us, is it still a useful tool in those instances, or should it not be used unless certain bars are leapt over? Well,
so my whole life for the last decade and a half has been creating sanctions for authoritarian regimes that commit gross human rights abuse, torture, mass murder, etc. So that and where there's no rule of law, where those tortures, murders, etc. Can be prosecuted, and that's the purpose. That's what the Magnitsky Act is, and it now exists. It exists, and any human rights violator can be sanctioned, and it's created an unbelievable amount of hope for victims. So if you're a Uyghur whose relatives are in the concentration camps in China, which they've set up, there used to be no recourse whatsoever, and the Uyghurs set up a campaign to expose the crimes committed against their people. They brought it to the U.S. and various other countries, and they have sanctioned the 4 Chinese generals who are in charge of of running these concentration camps. I would say that it's hard, and one of my big complaints is that it's very difficult to get people sanctioned who do terrible things, but it is possible, and it does create hope for victims, which they never had before.
And you mentioned you'd been in touch with the British government about what's happening here and the response. What's your assessment of what is going on right now? What would you like them to do in the near future?
Well, so you have these oligarchs who stole. So most Russian oligarchs got their money dishonestly through graft and theft and embezzlement and various other things, and corruption. And so these guys knew a long time ago that their money might be, someone's going to come after their money. They didn't think the people who are coming after their money would be the ones coming after their money. They thought the new Russian government might come after their money, or their competitors might come after their money, or extortion artists may come after their money. And so they spent the last 20 years putting together the most watertight asset protection schemes available. And perhaps there are people in this room that were, maybe there's even a session on these things here. I haven't, I haven't listened to the whole thing. I mean, the healthcare is good and everything, but and the asset protection schemes have allowed oligarchs to evade, many of them to evade sanctions. And so what's happening right now is we're saying, well, we found these oligarchs, we found these people that are Putin cronies that help support the Putin war effort. We've frozen some of their money, but there's a lot of really complex stuff that we can't understand because these are the best asset protection schemes that money can buy. And so the next step is going after this type of stuff. And it's not going to be easy because the very best minds in the world have put these things together, and that's going to be the big challenge for Western governments.
Sure. But what about this idea that until certainly 2014 and Crimea, Russian oligarchs were an accepted part of London life? The Russian government was engaged with by several British prime ministers. The money was not especially questioned. 2014 happened, that changed the music a little bit, but Roman Abramovich still owned Chelsea Football Club, and away we go. So then things changed dramatically, and it seems that there's a sort of retroactive moral judgment in place over what happened in those years previously. Do you, A, think that's true, and B, think it's problematic or confusing, the situation now?
Well, I mean, I fell victim to the Russian government long before anyone else did. And I had an opportunity to see up close and personal that Putin is a murderer and a thief and a very bad man. And I tried to explain to people in the government here, and the government in the United States, and the European Union, that we needed to have a tougher policy towards Russia. And nobody wanted to hear a word of it. There was too much money sloshing around, too many people benefiting, too much economic interest. The Germans were buying all this gas, and the same with the Italians. And here in London, oh my God, the real estate agents and the private bankers, and everybody was just cleaning up. And nobody, and I was really not welcome. My message wasn't welcome. The robust response to the crimes committed against me and my colleagues was weak. And then Russia invaded Georgia, and everyone said, no, this is, we don't know whose fault it was. Crimea, they described it as Russian-backed separatists. It was a civil war. It was not our business. Syria, nobody even said a word. After Salisbury, people were going to the World Cup in Moscow, and so it must be very confusing for Russian oligarchs right now to see, and for Putin. Putin thought, that there's no way he could go into Ukraine, and there'd be no problem, and he's like, wait a second, there's never been a problem. I've done all this terrible stuff, and there's never been a problem before. Now, why all of a sudden there's this problem? And so it is confusing for him. I find it very upsetting that it took us this long, because I think if we had been tough on Russia before or after Crimea or after Georgia or after any of them, a number of things, Putin might have had a different calculus, but he thought there would be no problem.
And in your view, does blame lie with various different parties? I mean, I suppose you would say that governments should have acted more quickly. Should property advisor who facilitated the purchase of a Highgate mansion in 2012 be looking at their shoes right now?
Well, I'm sure a lot of them are. Well, first of all, the blame is 95% Putin's. He's a bad man. And then 5% the West, and mainly the government. I mean, a guy who's working in Highgate, working on a mansion, he's just looking for signals from the government which way to go. Sure. But there was this one interesting documentary. It was on Channel 4. It was maybe some of you saw it. It was called From Russia with Cash, I think, and it was produced by a Russian opposition fellow, a friend of mine, who is a big jolly guy, and he looks like a big Russian, and he got a female journalist, who's a very, very beautiful woman, and he pretended he was the deputy minister of health, and this very much younger, beautiful woman was his mistress, and he went around with a hidden camera, going with real estate agents to look at the most beautiful flats and houses in London, with a hidden camera boasting about how he was stolen all the money from the AIDS drugs that were supposed to be distributed as Deputy Minister of Health, and not wanting anyone to know it was his, and you had all these obsequious estate agents explaining to him how he could avoid any kind of, really trying to help him. And so I'm sure that there are some very honest people in selling those houses in Highgate, and I'm sure that there's a few dishonest ones, the ones who we saw on that show. And I think it's hard to generalize, but definitely some people, the dollar signs were bigger than their morality.
And when should Western governments have acted then to send those signals to private businesses that do have bottom lines to worry about? When should governments have done what they've done now, if you think it would have been the right action several years ago?
Well, I think that Russia invaded Georgia. I don't see how sort of, if you were to look at it relative to what's happening right now, it's a sovereign state, it's a neighboring country. It was a peaceful neighbor. They took over 20% of the country. They killed a lot of Georgian troops. That should have been the moment when we got tough, and that was the moment in 2008. That would have been very helpful to all the people who are now trying to extricate themselves from this stuff.
Sure. And thinking again about the advisory firms that are part of the world that we cover and represented in the audience today, can you sympathize with people who say that it's still difficult, it's still not clear? Our friend Bob earlier said he wouldn't know where the bright line was. He wouldn't know where the black and the white parted, and he thinks there are many shades of grey. I mean, we can think about a sanctioned individual, fairly clear that in many cases it wouldn't be desirable to work with them, but someone who's Russian and has happened to have lived in the UK for the last 20 years and had their own business that's made money legitimately, of course you could work with them. But then, humanity is messy, personal connections are messy, business connections are messy. There are all kinds of cases between those two ends of the spectrum.
Well, so what I can tell you is that since Putin came to power, there's no such thing as an independently wealthy Russian in Russia. Everybody who is wealthy with the permission of Vladimir Putin. He's come to everybody. And he says you can continue to hold some of your wealth, or maybe all of your, or half of your wealth, or whatever, but I'm going to want you to do this, 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 and this for me. And some people said no, and they ended up losing their money, and some people ended up dying. And then most of the people said yes. And so I think that one can pretty much generalize to say that anybody who was a wealthy Russian oligarch in Russia, and that doesn't apply to your example of somebody living here for the last 20 or 30 years, but somebody who got wealthy in Russia and maintained their wealth during the Putin regime is somebody who you should terminate business relations with, because they maybe have not gotten all the way down the list, and maybe they never will, but if they do get down the list and they get sanctioned, it's an absolute nightmare to be looking after somebody who's sanctioned. And it's even worse if they're sanctioned somewhere else and not here. So I remember in 2017, one of the big oligarchs was sanctioned in the United States for being involved in election interference. That he was caught, one of the 7 oligarchs caught. And he had a huge cash balance at one of the big Swiss banks. I think it was like $1 billion. And he thought it would be better to probably move that money to Gazprom Bank. And so he puts in his money transfer order. And so the Swiss bank has got a big problem because if they move the money, they're potentially in violation of U.S. OFAC sanctions. And if it's $1 billion, then they could potentially be subject to a $3 billion fine from the U.S. government. So not a great idea to move the money. At the same time, Switzerland hasn't sanctioned this oligarch. The United States has sanctioned the oligarch. And so the oligarch could say, I was planning on investing this $1 billion in this startup that went up 27 times, so I'm going to sue you for $27 billion in Swiss court because that was the loss because you didn't move my money. And so the Swiss bank is in an absolutely impossible situation. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. And so what did the CEO of the Swiss bank do the very next day? He gathered up all of his account officers and said, I want you to fire any client that has anything to do with any kind of stuff going on in Russia because they're just not worth it. And I think that's for anybody interested in whatever the current income flow is, you have to look at the huge down the road liability that could come from this thing, and it just seems like a smart move to just get rid of these people altogether.
In a way, treating people in that way, making individuals collateral damage in the quest of a higher goal, is a sort of thing that that Vladimir Putin is doing, isn't it? Like rather than looking at the individual cases.
Yeah, well, if you take your guy who's been here for 20 years and made all their money in the UK, that's an individual case. Yeah. No one needs to be prejudiced because they have a Russian last name. But if they made their money in Russia, if you believe my logic, then there you go.
Yes. I suppose that might be the problem, that having a blanket rule according to sort of a logical formula like that, people slip outside it and people get treated unfairly because of it.
Yeah, life is not fair. That's what it comes down to. Imagine that we're dealing with terrorism, somebody had some dealings with Osama bin Laden. Is that unfair to get rid of him, or should you really pick apart to make sure that maybe they were honest people dealing with Osama bin Laden? That's what we're talking about here.
Sure. On the topic of treating people in a certain way because they have a Russian last name, you're married to a Russian, and so you have a clear view of this problem or emergence of what one might call Russophobia. Do you think that is active in society today? Do you think that people are treating all Russian people in a certain way because of the actions of the president of the country?
Well, I think my wife and my colleagues who work for me are all Russian, and we're very actively trying to punish and oppose the Putin regime. I'm working with Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife, who's Russian, and we go around actively opposing the Putin regime, and there's many other Russians that do that, and I don't think that those people are subject to any kind of Russophobia. But I do think, and I've seen this myself, that there are many Russians that are living in London who are really keeping their heads down and not saying anything. And this is one of those moments. It's where you have to say something. It's like Germans during the Nazi, I think you should probably be anti-German and anti-Nazi during the Second World War, and that was perfectly reasonable. And if any Germans were standing out against Hitler, then they were the good ones. But anyone who keeps their head down, just trying to avoid trouble, I don't think that they deserve huge sympathy right now. This is a terrible thing that's going on. It's a fascist regime that's doing terrible stuff, and I'm not hugely sympathetic to people who are whining about not being able to travel as easily or whatever. These are minor problems. People are being bombed overnight, every night, killed, just going to sleep and then waking up dead, or not waking up because of bombs being lobbed at them. Vladimir Putin just created the most extensive environmental disaster that's been seen in this continent ever, with the explosion of the dam. He's threatening to blow up a nuclear power plant, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I think that all these issues are just such, minor ripples in the water compared to what's going on. It's hard to even think about them.
Sure. We have a chance to put some questions to Bill. We have a hand in the front row. Matthias, have you got a question for Bill?
So Bill, you said we have to blame ourselves in the West that we stood up so late against Putin, and also when you look at how slow the West was to arm Ukraine in this war, I mean, that's another thing to be ashamed of. So in your talks, right, so the US was supplying those HIMARS rockets, right, and then the other rockets, the Army tactical missiles that go much faster, they haven't been supplied yet, even though, right, the Ukrainians are begging for it. Do you see that coming? Is there a way that, this war can be ended faster by better equipping Ukraine, also with the F-16 jets and all that?
Well, you remember at the start of the war, so, and by the way, thank you for your support from the very beginning on all this stuff.
Sure.
This gentleman here has been on my side long before anyone ever believed in me. I can remember when we first started this whole thing, Germany wouldn't let us fly British aircraft into Poland supplied with equipment because they were so scared of upsetting the Russians. And now Germans are supplying tanks. And so they keep on committing more and more atrocities, and every time they commit an atrocity, things become more and more, everybody gets more and more angry. And by the end of this whole thing, I think we'll be supplying the Ukrainians with everything they possibly need. My big fear is that, and this is what Putin is holding out for, is that if he can just wait until November 2024, there's a chance that Trump becomes the next US president. And if Trump becomes president, then all US support for Ukraine stops on that day. And that's his big, long shot bet. And if that happens, then, who knows who wins the war.
Thank you. Do you have other questions? Please. Just here in the third row. Your voice may carry if you've got a booming voice.
Thank you. What are the legislative changes that need to be made in the UK to sell the frozen assets in the UK? And do you think that's going to happen? And what does it look like?
So my feeling is that, if you were to, the Prime Minister here and the President in America have all looked at these frozen assets and asked their chief legal advisor, can we seize these assets? And the chief legal advisor says, no, not possible. However, if the Prime Minister asks a different question to say, how can we seize these assets? Then they say, well, actually, you do it this, and this way, because every legal question, there's no black and white legal answers to anything. The key to this whole thing is that we're going to get tired of spending money. We have cost of living crisis, mortgage crisis, this crisis, that crisis, and we're going to get tired of spending money. And it's going to be the money that drives the decision to do it. And I don't know how quickly that's going to happen, but I think it's going to happen reasonably quickly in the same way as we wouldn't supply tanks a year ago, and now we're supplying tanks. And so it just seems to me, and I'm involved in these conversations, and you can see you can absolutely see the way, first of all, the momentum building of experts and credible people saying this is the right thing to do, politicians saying it's the right thing to do, legal arguments being made that it's a legal thing to do. And so it's really a political issue, not a legal issue, and I think it will be resolved. I can't predict exactly how long it takes. Politics, particularly when it comes to international agreements, because you can't do this by yourself. You have to do this, all the countries have to do this together. And the pace at which this happens, I think, pretty much will be determined by how terrible Putin is in the future. The more terrible stuff he does, the more likely it is to happen, and the quicker it is to happen.
And one just there as well.
There might be people in back, we just don't see them.
It's quite possible.
I wondered, at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about one of the things that will really have an impact is the embargoing of oil. And I wanted to know how realistic you think that is as a solution. And if we do that, if there are any knock-on effects, i.e. the oil coming via other countries or from Russia to another country, then to whoever. Oh, and thank you. And then also, then us buying oil from other countries that perhaps have their own issues?
Well, so it's really, really hard to embargo oil when oil prices are high, when inflation is raging. And so I think that it's going to be a hard thing to stomach. First of all, it's physically very simple to embargo oil. You could basically say that any ship that moves Russian oil can never dock in a Western port again. Any insurance company that insures a ship can never insure again or be sanctioned. You can lean on any country where you can spot them buying Russian oil, and it'll stop. But of course, nobody wants to exacerbate the current inflation crisis. But if we are going into a recession, which I'm not a macroeconomist, so I can't say that with any certainty, but if we were to go into a recession, one of the biggest victims of recessions are commodity prices, and oil prices could go down. And if they did go down, and inflation goes down, then I think it's a totally different ballgame. And as the war continues to rage on, and as we're looking for more and more solutions, if it's not as painful to do, it may very well be a policy that's pursued. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime in the near future.
There is a question at the back. Rupert Phelps.
Thank you.
Sorry, Adenike has the microphone.
It is, sorry. Thank you. You had mentioned 3 possible scenarios where Russians may have either acquired or maintained their wealth. The 3rd scenario you mentioned was out of fear of their life, right? You mentioned that.
I did. Sorry, could you speak up?
Would you like me to? Where would you like me to?
No, just the last 3 words.
The last part. The last scenario you gave, you said sometimes they went along with out of fear of their lives, right? Okay, but then later on, you lumped everyone together. Is there any thoughts that you would have in terms of how one could perhaps treat these people? They're acting under duress, it would appear.
Well, so the there are a lot of people say, are there any good oligarchs out there? And I've known some of these oligarchs for a very long time. I was there before they ever became oligarchs, and some of them seemed like nice guys at the very beginning. But and I can remember like the German Greff, who was the head of Spearbank. He was like really a good man and sort of spoke English and was sort of helpful. And Arkady Dvorkovich, who was the president's economic advisor, went to Duke University. And then all these guys went off into the dark side. They really did. And so I don't want to be too generous to them now. Everybody made a choice. You could have abandoned your wealth. You could have said, I'm not going to do business with a dictatorship. I'm not going to do business with these people, and left. And some people did do that. Not very many. Most people said, I'm ready to go to the dark side for money. And I don't often speak to wealth management conferences, but I do speak often to like schools and high schools and university. There always was some kid from Russia who's like inspired by my story and said, I want to go and change. I want to go back to my home and change the country. And I say, don't, because you have 2 choices. You can either go back and be in opposition and become a dissident, and then you'll probably end up in jail or dead, or you go back and you decide not to do that, and then you become part of the criminal enterprise. Why don't you just stay out until something changes, because you're not going to change the country in a criminal dictatorship. And so all these people made their choices, and they made their bed, they have to live in it.
Did we have one at the back there? Rupert, yep.
Thank you. Bill, what's your response to people who ask the following question? What's the difference between the Allies, so-called, invading a sovereign country, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and Putin invading a sovereign country?
Well, the first is that they shouldn't have invaded Iraq. The way, I mean, that's something that a lot of the global South puts out there, saying, well, it's all terrible, so let's just let it all go. I'm not a big fan of the war in Iraq. That doesn't mean that I should excuse Putin for doing what he's done in Ukraine. It's there's no, I mean, and by the way, I mean, this is a much bigger discussion, but what Putin did in Ukraine was completely different than what America did in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a monster. It was a terrible idea to go in and just try to do regime change. But Putin, actually, let's go back one. Putin or Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and it was a totally justified war going and freeing Kuwait, and we did. The second time we went and invaded Iraq, that was a totally unjustified war based on false premises. What Putin has done with Ukraine is there's no way of justifying it, and we need to punish him badly for doing it. And by the way, if he succeeds in Ukraine, he doesn't stop in Ukraine. He needs to be at war. He'll go on to Estonia, and then we have a much bigger problem because then we have to fight him ourselves instead of having the Ukrainians fight him.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
It's almost there.
Thank you. I was just wondering what role you think Alexei Navalny has in the Russian situation at the moment.
So Alexei Navalny, for those of you, probably everyone knows his name, but in case you don't, he was the opposition activist, very popular among young people, very technologically savvy, made these beautiful YouTube videos about Putin, showing his palaces and all billions of dollars and all this crazy stuff of Putin and his regime. He was tolerated for some period of time. He was very popular. He got too popular. Putin tried to kill him with Novichok. He didn't die. He went into a coma, was in Germany, and then returned to Russia to basically be imprisoned. And so he and my friend Vladimir and another one named Ilya Yashin are what I would call the sort of ANC, Nelson Mandela type of characters in Russia right now. And there is potentially a moment for them. If my sort of optimistic scenario, and this I don't put a high probability on this, but my optimistic scenario is that if Ukraine succeeds in expelling Russia from their territory, including Crimea, the Putin regime will completely fracture. And if they fracture, all these people will be getting on their jets to leave Russia, and the people will look for new leadership. And the new leadership could be, in a low probability scenario, Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Kara-Murza, and Ilya Yashin are the people who are reasonable people. They believe in democracy, free speech, free press, etc. That's the dream scenario. Not a high probability scenario, but
what's the more likely scenario?
The more likely scenario is what we saw last weekend, a warlord scenario. You know, a nationalist who's more vicious than Putin coming in. And everybody, I should point out that the entire Western sort of elite are all breathing a big sigh of relief that Putin is still in power. And I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin is the most monstrous man, and I understand why everybody is so scared of him, and he maybe is the most scary guy. But he announced before he was doing this that the war in Ukraine was an unjustified war. He said it was done on false pretext. You know, how is Putin a good guy when he's invaded Georgia, took Crimea, went into Ukraine, took Syria, bombed Syria, threatened nuclear war, blew up a dam, poisoned people, all his opponents around the world? He's a monster. I think that the main issue, we shouldn't be worrying too much about, I mean, which monster it is. We should just put up our biggest defenses around these monsters and just, you know, we're now in a war. We had the Cold War, we had the Iron Curtain during the Soviet times. I think we need a new Iron Curtain for these guys, and, you know, let the chips fall where they may, but we shouldn't be doing anything to support Putin at this point.
Okay, so you would, if someone said to you, this could get worse, the path we're going down could lead to a more hostile leader of Russia, more division between countries, less cooperation, more...
Well, I'm saying there's no worse. We're already at the worst. The way that Putin is behaving is based on what are his opportunities and constraints. Every dictator, every strong man that comes into Russia would face the same type of opportunities and constraints. It's not like Prigozhin is a worse man than Putin. They're both monsters. They're both murderers. They're both killed many people. You know, Prigozhin happens to make videos of using a sledgehammer on people's skulls, but otherwise he's the same as Putin.
And so let's try and end on a somewhat uplifting note if we can. What chain of events, briefly, if you can, Bill, to answer a complicated question, what chain of events or conditions would need to be met in order to bring about a Navalny presidency or something of that order, so a solution that's not just as bad or worse?
Well, I think that if the Ukraine wins the war, the Russians are not going to tolerate Putin. But it's not just Putin. It's going to be all this, the whole stuff around him, everything. They're going to say, well, why did we sacrifice? Right now they've lost 225,000 men. By then, who knows how many will be? They're going to ask the question: why did we lose so many people for a war that we lost? Why did we? Why this unbelievable economic damage? Who are these losers who did this? We don't want any of them. And then my fantasy is that the marauding people go and break into the prison where Alexei Navalny is being held and bring him out on their shoulders and foist him out to the Kremlin, and he's the one who repairs Russia, repairs the relations with the West, and tries to bring Russia back into the international fold in a reasonable and decent way.
Bill Browder, thank you very much indeed for being with us. It's been a great pleasure.